I think that the word socialist is losing its sting in large part as a consequence of Bernie's candidacy. And it is stimulating a really fascinating conversation in America about where is that dividing line between public and private. In other words, it used to be, prior to the Reagan era, it was conventional wisdom that the public sector, the government sector, this is what we all collectively own, it's what we all collectively administer, and it should be done for the good of all. I got into radio when I was a teenager. First of all, when I was maybe 9 years old, I built a little 100 milliwatt transmitter, and which will reach like 3 houses around your house. And I had a record player, and I was very into electronics. I was a ham radio operator when I was 13. And I built a little radio station, and I did that at home as a kid. And then when I was 16, I got a job at MSU in Brody Hall in the radio station. Each of the major dorms had a radio station, and so I was on WBRD, as I recall. And I did that for about 6 weeks, made a tape, got a job at WITL, AM and FM, Lansing, Michigan, which was the country western station, country station. #1 station in Lansing. It was great. It was a weekend, DJ, and I thought I hated country music. And I discovered that I absolutely loved country music, but I was a teenager in the 60s, and it was like rock and roll or nothing. And I worked there for a year or so, and then went to did an all-night show, progressive rock show, did top 40, and then went back to Whittle and did news for 7 years until 78. And then I got out of that, and then in 2002, November of 2002, Thanksgiving, we were living in Vermont, and Louise and I drove back to Michigan to visit our family for Thanksgiving. And all the way there, all I could get was, actually it was odd, it was like Sean Hannity's show repeated itself 3 or 4 times on that 14-hour drive. And he was doing a live remote from Habitat for Humanity, and only he was calling it Hannity for Humanity, and was talking about how no liberal's going to get this house. And which kind of offended my sensibilities. But more than that, I was thinking, half the country votes Democratic, roughly. It's not like we're a totally red country. We're a purple country. There's got to be a market for the left-wing version of what Hannity's doing. So I wrote an op-ed for Common Dreams in, I think, probably around December of 2002, titled Talking Back to Talk Radio, which basically was a business plan. I've been in radio, I've been in the business, I know how it works. Here's how you can do it from a business point of view. Here's how you do it from a programming point of view, and put that out there. And then thought, in '97 we had sold an ad agency in Atlanta, and so we were essentially retired. And I thought, it'd be fun to try this out, see if we can do this. So, putting my money where my mouth was. So we found a radio station in Burlington, Vermont that would put me on the air for 2 hours on a Saturday morning after the swap meet. And for a few months there, I did a morning show. About half the calls I got were, "Is that John Deere tractor still available?" But again, we made a tape and took that to IE America Radio Network, which at the time was the only progressive radio network in America, preceded Air America. It was out of Detroit. It was owned by the UAW. And they picked me up noon to 3 and put us on 29 stations and Sirius XM, or Sirius at that time. XM was a competitor at the time. And that's how the show started. And then, Shelley and Anita Drobny asked me to come out to Chicago and meet with them and John Sinton. They had read my article, and they were thinking of starting a network based on what I had written about. And they did. They started Air America. And after a year or so of competing with Air America, maybe it was 2 years, whatever it was, they started syndicating my show. And then but I always owned the show. In fact, I think I was the only show. Ring of Fire was the other one, Papantonio and Kennedy's show. The only 2 shows that were actually owned by the hosts as opposed to being an employee. I think it was a mixture of things. The biggest one was that they were undercapitalized. Fox News, Roger Ailes had, back when he was in the Nixon White House, had proposed or signed off on a proposal for something called GOP TV, and which kind of a early Fox News. Nixon couldn't raise the money, and so it never happened. And then he met Rupert Murdoch, and Murdoch said, sure, let's do this. But they lost $100 million a year for roughly 5 years before they made any money. So you could say, hey, Sean Hannity lost them in the aggregate maybe $400 million. Isn't that a terrible failure? Well, no, after the 5th year they started making money. They caught an audience, and now they make a lot of money. Air America, when they declared bankruptcy, I think that they had gone through something like $16 or $17 million over a 5-6 year period. It's not a lot of money for a national radio network, particularly when part of their business model was leasing and radio stations. So I think that being undercapitalized was their biggest sin. There were some management problems. Some of the people in management really shouldn't have been there, and there were some programming issues that I disagreed with. I thought that they were creating some programs that were more like television than radio. There's a real big difference in those mediums. But I think the real big problem is they ran out of cash. Yeah, I started my first business when I was 17. It was a TV repair shop and stereo repair shop across the street from Michigan State University. And it was in the back of a head shop, yeah. And we called it the electronics joint, and our logo was a joint with a TV antenna on it. And then we got a little less hippie when what I was doing was the guy who owned the head shop, I rented a shelf from him for $25 a month, and people would bring electronic equipment in to have it fixed. I'd pick it up every night, take it home and fix it, and bring it back the next day, and he'd collect the money, and he took a percentage of the money too. I think it was a quarter. And we grew out of that shelf in the head shop in about 4 months, and so we moved down the street and rented a place and ended up with 4 technicians and 6 or 7 employees total. My soon-to-be wife was our bookkeeper, and it was the first business I ever owned. It was also the only business that I've started that went down in flames, and I learned a lot from that. I learned an awful lot from that. So yeah, and then after that, we started an herbal tea company. We started an advertising agency. In '78, Louise and I moved to New Hampshire and started a community for abused kids. In '83, we moved back to Atlanta and started a travel agency. Built that from nothing up to about $6 million value. Got it on the front page of the Wall Street Journal. Sold it in '86. Retired to Germany. Moved to Germany with our kids for a year, living at and working with the nonprofit organization I've been working with since 1978, Salem International, that we had based the Community for Abused Kids on. And then we came back in '87 from Germany and back to Atlanta and started an advertising agency, and that's the company I sold in '97 when we moved to Vermont to, quote, retire, and started the radio show, which just turned into this, it was going to be a hobby. And now I'm doing 4 hours of media every day, 5 days a week.
And where are you living?
Again, this goes back to my childhood. My mom was an English major. She graduated magna cum laude from MSU back in the late 40s. And her aspiration was to be a writer, and she held writers the way people today think of movie stars. And I mean, she was just, and my dad had 20,000 books in the house, the whole basement. I mean, he had it organized like a library. He was a very organized guy. And I started writing as a young teenager. By the time I moved out of the house when I was 16, I had 56 rejection slips. I papered my bedroom wall with rejection slips, mostly for bad poetry and short stories. And I just kept doing it. And now I've got, I think, around 25 books in print.
Well, the first several books that you wrote were about attention deficit disorder.
Yeah, first several that I published.
Right.
I'd written probably 10 or 12 books before that, but none of them, thankfully, were ever published. Arthur C. Clarke says your first million words are practice, and it's true. But yeah, ADD. And that was the product of two things. When I was the executive director of the residential treatment facility up in New Hampshire, Salem Children's Village, and my wife was the program director. And so my job principally was to raise money and get publicity and things like that, the administrative stuff. But I noticed that virtually all of the kids that came in were coded as hyperactive, or back then it was referred to as hyperkinesis syndrome, hyperkinetic children, these kind of things. And in '78, the year that we started that, I think the year before that, Ben Feingold had published his book, Why Your Child is Hyperactive. And he proposed that it was food dyes, the salicylates specifically, that these children were reacting to with functionally an allergy. He was a pediatric allergist, by the way, so he had a certain bias. We did a study on our kids over a 6-month period, putting them on his diet, and we found that out of 34 kids, we had one kid that we could turn on and off like a light switch by putting salicylates into or taking them out of his diet. But he also had just horrible psoriasis, and they seemed to make his psoriasis worse. So I think that for a very small subset of the population, there is that allergy connection. But for most, I think it's just a way of brain wiring. And so I published, my first published piece on that was in, must have been around 1980, and it was in the Journal of Orthomolecular Psychiatry, and it was on the hyperkinetic syndrome, suggesting that it was not a disease, but simply a different way of having your brain wired. And then when one of our children was diagnosed with ADHD in high school in the mid-'80s, and the psychologist sat in the room with him and said, you know, forget about going to college, you know, you should become a car mechanic, you know, you're good with your hands, you know, and by the way, if you're going to be a car mechanic, work on the foreign-made cars because the pay is a lot better. You know, if you're fixing Mercedes, you can make more money than fixing Fords. And at this point, my son is like tears in his face, you know, because he wanted to go to college. And I thought, this sucks. You know, this is a terrible way to describe this. And so I wrote my first book, ADD, A Different Perception, essentially to my son, and saying, you're not broken, nothing wrong with you. You have a different skill set than many other kids, but you also, there's a lot of people in your tribe. And he now has a master's degree in science and is running a business of his own based, you know, in that field. God bless him. So yeah, so I wrote a couple of books on that. And then that became Time magazine did a story on it. It became a national bestseller, and so my publisher was like, I want another book and another book. And so probably Ben Franklin. It's been a while since I wrote those books. But yeah, that clearly, in fact, there's in ADD, A Different Perception, I profile a couple of people, and as I recall, it was Ben Franklin, Thomas Edison, Sir Richard, what's his name? Same name as the guy who married Elizabeth Taylor.
Burton?
Burton, yeah, famous British explorer. He was such a classic case. Probably Richard Burton, Elizabeth Taylor's husband, had ADD too, you know, given his bouncing around and whatnot. But Ben Franklin never held one job for more than 3 years. He reinvented himself over 30 times, literally completely changed his profession, lived all over the world. He was easily bored. I think that the ADD can be, for a person who has a lower IQ, is more of a challenge. For a person like Franklin, who is a genius and had ADD, it can be a really useful combination. So I think for everybody it can be a useful combination. Yes, he definitely was. An inventor and you know, writer and publisher, and like I said, he helped create the United States of America. I wrote that book because I kept encountering revisionist history, specifically and particularly about Jefferson. There was kind of a resurgence of interest in Jefferson, I think largely after 9/11. But there are a couple of historians, and I put that in quotes, I'm not sure that they have degrees in history, who were suggesting that Jefferson was a Bible-thumping Christian and that, you know, it was part of this whole America was founded on Christian values meme that there's several very well-organized groups out there pushing. And a number of other myths about Jefferson that I thought were important to knock down and just tell the actual story. of Jefferson's life and what he did and what he was promoting. Yeah, it was Vermont, actually.
Vermont.
It was and in fact, that's what really got me into it. You're right. I'd forgotten about that. How could I forget that? Time passes, right? We bought this house in 2001, I think it was, in Montpelier. And in the attic, there was a couple of boxes of old books, the attic of the carriage house that was attached to it. And they were just horribly weather damaged. You know, they had no value. Whoever had the house before us just left them there. And in fact, they'd been left there for a long time. There were a bunch of newspapers in the boxes from the 1930s. And there was a 10 or 20 volume set, I think it was a 20 volume set, the collected writings of Thomas Jefferson, which has only been published once in the history of the United States. And it was in 1909 by the Thomas Jefferson Memorial Association. And it had his personal diaries and all his letters and his autobiography and just all this stuff. And I spent a year, I mean, I was, quote, retired. I spent a year just reading, just living inside Jefferson's brain. And then, you know, like I said, I'm reading all this stuff out in the world that completely contradicts what I just learned from. And I realized that there's something to be said for an objective voice of history. You know, Jefferson, obviously, in a lot of his writings, was thinking about the posterity. He was thinking about his own reputation and presented himself well, as you would expect. But the history is fairly clear. So, yeah, that led me to that book. That actually also led me to, when I started writing that book, the first draft became the book on equal protection, actually, because it was, Jefferson would be horrified by the idea that a corporation is a person. Because, well, first of all, the corporate form in its modern form largely didn't exist back then. But although the British East India Company was the first modern corporation, Queen Elizabeth the first chartered it in, 1600, 1601. The first corporation was the Golden Hind. She did that, and she made a fortune on that, her and the members of Parliament. So then they chartered the British East India Company. And in 1773, Jefferson had published a pamphlet called A Summary View of the Rights of British Americans, as I recall. It's been almost 2 decades since I read this stuff. And it was basically a booklet about how to be a good British citizen in North America. That was in the summer. In the fall, late fall, early winter, England was suffering through a recession, a serious recession, a worldwide recession. And so they passed the Tea Act, which for some reason most people think was a tax increase on tea. But what it was actually, the East India Company stock was almost all owned by members of the British Parliament and the royal family. And the British East India Company was like going down the tubes. They were, because of this recession. And they had a monopoly on most of the businesses in the United States. And tea was what everybody drank. People didn't drink coffee in the early colonies. And there were, every block or every other block had a tea shop on it. They were the kind of cultural centers. And so the Tea Act of 1773 was the largest tax cut at that point in time, corporate tax cut in the history of the world. Not only did the East India Company have over 10 million pounds, as I recall. I think tons would be too much, but whatever it was a massive amount of tea in stock in the UK. They'd already paid tax on. And so it was a tax rebate on all that stuff. It was a tax cut combined with a rebate. So they got money back from the government. And then the goal was to sell that tea into North America. Because the problem that they were having in North America was about half the tea being consumed in all these tea shops was from, quote, smugglers. You know, it was from the Dutch trading companies that were trading, American trading companies. It was being brought in illegally. And they'd tried stopping that trade. They, you know, go all the way back to Captain Kidd. You know, let's hire a pirate and you know, stop it. They couldn't stop it. There was no way they could stop it. So they decided to undercut it. And so the British East India Company was bringing all this super discounted tea into the United States. And the citizens of from Philadelphia up to Boston just freaked out and started this huge campaign to block the tea from even coming in. And in Charleston, they prevented them from coming into the harbors. In D.C., they prevented them from coming into the harbors. But they finally docked in Boston. And that led to basically a $1 million, in today's dollars, act of vandalism. They vandalized 3 of the ships quietly, respectfully, interestingly enough. I tracked down a copy of the only eyewitness account and got the original book. It was published in 1883 by Bliss and Company, and it was George Roundtree Hughes. And it had a long title, you know. In fact, he was the guy who came up with the phrase Boston Tea Party. And because they'd all sworn an oath of silence to each other, and this was 50 years later, and pretty much everybody else was dead, and he had been 16 or 17 years old when he participated in it. And so he wrote the book, and it was remarkable. I mean, this was an act of vandalism against the largest corporation in the world. So when you say, why would Jefferson be horrified by the idea that a corporation was a person? After the Boston Tea Party, Jefferson stopped talking about how to be a good citizen in the United States of the UK and started talking about separation. And this led right to 1776. So in a very real way, America was founded on a revolt against corporate power. Yeah, that was one of the most fascinating things that I got out of reading Jefferson's stuff and then digging deep into the history of that era. That is in What Would Jefferson Do? The myth of the rich founders. And there's been a couple of good histories about that published since that time. The wealthiest man among the people who signed the Declaration of Independence was John Hancock. And his net worth in today's dollars, or in 2004 dollars when I wrote the book, would be about $700,000. He was not a mind-bogglingly rich guy. Land had very little value. Some of them had fancy houses, but they were fancy houses by the standards of North America. They wouldn't have even been considered a squire's house in the UK. I mean, these people were not rich. There were rich people at the time of the American Revolution. The Johnson family, for example, who had a castle on the Hudson with several hundred African slaves and several hundred European slaves as, you know, Knights of the Round Table. I mean, they had kind of recreated this whole time. They were fabulously wealthy, and there were a number of families like that. Virtually all of them left. That family fled to Canada during the Revolution. So after the Revolution, Jefferson died in bankrupt. Washington died bankrupt. Madison was having problems. They were all just skating by, and among the slave owners, the slaves were their principal asset, which is a terrible and grim part of our history also. And then the other part was, Jefferson worked aggressively to try to stop slavery, which is a part of his story that's not so often told. When he was in his early 20s in the Virginia House of Burgesses, he introduced legislation to end slavery in Virginia, and he was so punished by it, they passed a law saying that if anybody in Virginia freed a slave, that slave would be arrested and as I recall, it was like something like 2 years of hard labor and then sold back into the slave market. So I just, I kind of wanted to set the record straight. Yeah, it's a fairly typical cycle. People see these things coming. When we started the Children's Village back in the 70s, it was a vegetarian program. I've been a vegetarian since '68, or maybe '67. And so we got some prominent vegetarians on our board, and Gloria Swanson was one of them. And I used to go to New York every 6 months, and we'd just make dinner together in her apartment and sit and chat, stay up until the wee hours and talk. And she'd tell me these wild stories. And Joe Kennedy was the perennial object of her scorn. And she talked about how Joe Kennedy got out of the market and how him and all his buddies knew that the crash was coming in 1929 and all this kind of stuff. I thought that was kind of interesting. It seems like we're recycling that now. We're sort of in a similar period. What we hoped would be the beginning of the end. the first stimulus, I mean, at the time we were losing 750,000 jobs a month. And that $800 million stimulus that we did here in the United States, well, a third of it was tax cuts, which don't generally stimulate the economy unless they're at the very bottom of the economic ladder, and most of them weren't. But it kind of jump-started us out of the horror that we were experiencing then. But then they couldn't get a second one or a larger one. We really, I think it was either Robert Reich or Paul Krugman who said there was a $2 trillion hole in the side of our economy, and we patched it with an $800 billion patch. It wasn't enough. And we also didn't change the fundamentals. We didn't reinstate Glass-Steagall. We didn't break up the big banks. We didn't hold the banksters accountable for what they did. We didn't change the derivative markets. We didn't make them more transparent or even just stop them altogether. At the time of, in 2007, just before the big crash, we had, I think there was in the neighborhood of $800 to $900 trillion in derivatives out there. These are kind of magical securities that are made up out of an underlying, they derive their value from an underlying asset, in this case mortgages. So you have $1 million worth of mortgages, you put an insurance policy on it for $1 million, and then you place a bet on that insurance, which is what AIG was doing. And then you place a bet on that insurance policy, say a $100 million bet that $1 million won't go bad. And then you place a $1 billion bet on the $100 million bet. And then you place a $100 billion bet on the $1 billion bet. And they just get bigger and bigger and bigger. I mean, the GDP of the entire planet is in the neighborhood of $56 trillion. And we had $800 to $900 trillion worth of derivatives. These just bets out there. And when that collapsed, it was massive. We get down to around 300 or 400 trillion. Nobody's really sure of these numbers, by the way, because there's not, Bank of International Settlements sort of collects the data. And we're back up now, the best guess is to in the neighborhood of $700 to $800 trillion in derivatives. So it's like we didn't fix these things, which is why I'm suggesting that crash has not stopped, actually. And in fact, it's gonna happen again, only worse. That's a phrase that I borrowed with acknowledgement from Franklin Roosevelt. And my favorite of his speeches was his acceptance speech in 1936 in Philadelphia, as I recall, July of 1936, and where he talked about the economic royalists. And he said, out of this industrial order, it was fairly predictable that a group of economic royalists would arise to try to take control of this. These economic royalists tell us, he went after them. And it really was, it was the big money fat cats who crashed the economy in '29 and who fought FDR throughout his presidency. And it's the big money fat cats who are crashing our economy right now. Yeah, and if you look at the time in the United States when the middle class was most prosperous, and this is the thing, when we measure prosperity in the United States, we tend to look at big numbers like GDP or the stock market. Those are not really the numbers that we should be looking at. If we're concerned about society as a whole, it should be how healthy is the middle class. And so what has happened over the years is that, with this massive deregulation, the middle class has been collapsing steadily, and the very wealthy have gotten super wealthy. I got this up close and personal. I learned this lesson myself in 1974 or 5. Terry O'Connor was my business partner. He recently passed away, and he and I owned this herbal tea company, and we were making a lot of money. It was a side business of the herbal tea company. We were selling ginseng to Larry Flint, and he was selling it in Hustler magazine, and he made $1 million, literally, and we made a couple $100,000, which was big money in '73. And my CPA came to me, and he said, you're getting close to, as I recall, it was a 40 or 50% tax bracket. And he said, you need to stop taking money out of your company and reinvest it and grow the company, because it's an asset that you own also, and it won't be taxed. But if you just keep taking this money out as pay. And so I did, and we added another product line, we added another 7 employees, we grew the company. And that's what happened back in the 70s when the top tax rate was 90% or 74%. I forget when it dropped. Yeah, I think Johnson dropped it down to 74% in 67. So yeah, it was. And back then, the average CEO made 30 times what his employees made. I probably made 6 or 8 times what my employees were making at that time. And there was a reason for it. If you made more than that, you got hit with these huge taxes. So keep the money in the company. Pay your employees well. All our employees had health insurance. All our employees were well paid. You know, we had other benefit programs for them. When we opened the travel agency in '83 in Atlanta, we had health care, or we had not only health care for all our employees. Most of the people working the travel agents were young women who had kids. We built a daycare center inside the travel agency. I mean, it was just a little kind of a corner, but it worked. Companies don't think like that anymore. Now it's how do we squeeze every penny out of this so that we can pump that money up to the guy at the top or the stockholders. And if there is a high tax level at the top, then the guys at the top say, okay, I got my 30 times, that's cool. You know, I mean, it used to be that the CEOs lived in the neighborhoods of the middle class, with the exception of the very, very uber rich. And you know, our economy is so different now than the economy that I grew up in. That was David Bossie. He was the president of Citizens United, and which produced a hit piece movie on Hillary Clinton. I think David would probably describe it that way too. And they were going to play it within the 90-day window when the Federal Election Commission said you can't do political activity, within this 90 days prior to an election. He took that case to the Supreme Court and won. The Supreme Court ruled, yes, we affirm corporations are people. Going back to 1886, we affirmed the 1976 Buckley versus Vallejo decision that spending money on politics, prior to 1976, it was considered a behavior which could be regulated. Since 1976, that Supreme Court case, Lewis Powell was very instrumental in making that happen. It has been considered a protected First Amendment free speech. And I think that, you know, time has proven me out. I mean, you know, look at the Donald Trump is agreeing with me right now, right? They're all owned by the rich people or the big corporations. Marco Rubio has his own personal billionaire who has been responsible for virtually his entire political career. Jeb Bush, I'm sure, has many, and not to mention family riches. You can just kind of go through the list, and when they lose their billionaires or when they lose their billionaire backing, they have to bail out. And to some extent, this happens on the Democratic side as well. The notable exception right now being Bernie Sanders, which is fascinating, by the way. Yeah, when I lived in Vermont, he came on our program and took calls. And it was so novel to have a member of Congress, a sitting member of the House of Representatives, who would take calls unfiltered, unscreened. I mean, my wife was the call screener at that time, Louise. And basically all we looked for in terms of not letting people on the air was people who were drunk or who were profane. You know, if they called up swearing or they sounded drunk, they didn't get on. But other than that, and Bernie just started taking these calls for an hour, and we called it Brunch with Bernie, and we've been doing it now since 2004, I think, every Friday. And it was amazing to me to discover a politician who never BS'd us, you know, never tried to do the slick, the wiggle words, the weasel words and all that kind of stuff. If he believed something, he would say, here's what I believe. If he didn't know the answer, he'd say, I don't know the answer. Frequently, he'd say, I'll find out, and he'd come back next week and say, hey, somebody called last week and wanted to know about this. And I'm just amazed and impressed by Senator Sanders. More often than I interview people with whom I do agree. Yeah. It's. I think that talk radio, basically, there's a couple of different categories of ways that you can do radio, and this goes back to some of the early articles that I was writing when I was just playing with the idea of doing it. One is a guest-driven show, and which is popular. It's more popular in television than radio. But the problem with a guest-driven show is that the show's only as good as its guests, and you can't always get great guests. You can have a caller-driven show, but then your show's only as good as your callers. You can have a news-driven show, which is basically what CNN does. And look at what happens when you have a crisis. Their ratings go up, and when you don't, they fall in the tank. Or you can have a host-driven show. And in the modern era, Rush Limbaugh really invented that genre. And so when we put our show together, we decided that it would be a host-driven show because I knew radio and I knew my topics. And so most of the radio show is just me talking to listeners. And then, you know, there's the old adage, people slow down for fistfights and car wrecks. You want to make it entertaining. You want to make it interesting. And I actually respect most of the people on the other side who I debate. My father was an Eisenhower Republican activist. When I was 13 years old in 1964, my dad and I went door to door for Barry Goldwater. In my heart, I knew he was right. I had read John Starmer's book, None Dare Call It Treason, the year earlier, and I was convinced that the State Department was filled with communists and that we were going to go down the tubes, and this was it. And 3 years later, the Vietnam War, in large part, I think, completely changed my political perspective. And then, from the time I was 16 until my dad died in 2006, he and I fought like cats and dogs about politics. And after the first couple of years, I mean, he actually threw me out of the house over a political argument one night when I was 16. But after a couple of years, we figured out how to do this without hurting our relationship. And my dad was my political foil throughout my life. He died a Republican. In fact, his two favorite pictures, when my father was dying in his living room, my brothers and I and a couple of their wives, Louise, were sitting with him. And as he was drawing his last breath, I was sitting there with my hand on his shoulder, and I looked across the bed that was in the living room now, and there on the wall were these two pictures, me shaking hands with Pope John Paul II, and George W. Bush on the aircraft carrier Abraham Lincoln declaring mission accomplished. And those were his, that was my dad, And so I learned that you can have a knockdown drag out with somebody and still respect them and love them even. And so that's become sort of a trademark of both my radio and TV show is to bring on both sides. I also think it's good for our viewers and listeners because they get to hear both sides of the argument. Like David Bossie saying, I want more speech. Well, that's fine. We all want more speech. But to say the American people are smart enough to figure out, to see through lies in advertising, for example, if that was true, then the industry that I owned 2 ad agencies over the years, the industry that I worked in for the better part of a decade, would not exist. I mean, if advertising didn't work, nobody would be doing it. And we'd have a completely different media model, completely different business model. The fact of the matter is that advertising does change people's minds. And if you spend $1 billion on advertising, you will produce a shift in opinion. And whether that should be done solely by and for the benefit of very wealthy individuals and large corporations in the political sphere or not is my fundamental disagreement with David and with Scalia and the others on the court who voted for Citizens United. I'm not altogether certain. I know a number of them I know and like and I'm friends with. There's a couple of conservative websites that love to do hit pieces on me. There was one a couple days ago that was, actually there were 2 in the last week. One was actually pretty straightforward, pretty honest. I had, Senator Whitehouse had called for corporations that fund climate denial to be prosecuted under the RICO Act, the same way that the tobacco companies were prosecuted in 1999 under the RICO Act for funding denial that tobacco causes cancer or is addictive. And that was a successful prosecution, by the way, 2006. The tobacco companies had to admit, yep, we were engaged in a crime. And so I went on the air and, debating with a conservative who was defending climate change denial and saying, if you're one of these guys who's like putting out the money and hiring the people and getting the message out, that's organized crime under the RICO statutes. You should be in jail. And they did a piece on this, and I thought, okay, they were criticizing me for it, but it was an honest portrayal. Then a couple days later, somebody else had, in the conservative media did a long hit piece on me where they took a logic chain that I went through on the air and deleted the entire middle of it. It was just a completely dishonest hit piece. So the first one I talked about on the air, I credited the author. I mean, hey, as like P.T. Barnum said, as long as you spell my name right. The second one, though, I just ignored. Regularly, and many of them, and over many years, I've gotten to know many of them quite well. That book started out as a book about neurolinguistic programming, NLP, which is a construct for communication. But it was a political year. As I recall, I wrote that in 2004 or 2008. It was one of the presidential years. And, or maybe it was one of the interstitial years, but whatever. I wanted it to be a political hand guide for Democrats, yeah. So this is for the 2008 election. And that's why it's called Cracking the Code, is understanding, how not only how language works, but how to use language successfully. The classic example is Frank Luntz renaming the estate tax as the death tax. It completely shifts the frame. It was, and continues to be. And it didn't come out until much later that a lot of the early research into what kind of wording would cause people to turn against the estate tax was funded by the Walton heirs, and to the tune of a fair amount of money. And yeah, it was effective. Yeah. I respond to that question with a question, which was posed to me in the fall of 2007 by, I believe, the number 2 guy in the Democratic Party in California. He might have been just the number 2 guy in the Democratic Party down in Los Angeles, but whatever. And he was African American. And he came on my program and he said, this was when Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama were fighting it out. And he said, nobody in America, at the end of the day, we can talk all we like about our first black president and all this kind of stuff, but nobody is going to vote for a guy who has only been in the Senate for 2 years, has basically very little experience in this field. He's African American and his middle name is Hussein. It ain't gonna happen. And this was an African American Democrat saying this on my program. And he was like, we have to get out there, and he says, I want to talk to the black community. We have to support Hillary Clinton because Barack Obama, there's no way he's going to become president. And yeah, guess who's president? So I think it's entirely possible that America will vote for a 70-something Jewish senator with a New York accent, because what he's saying is right. And this is the thing I learned in Vermont. Louise and I lived in Vermont for 10 years. And if you go up and drive around the Northeast Kingdom, which is the most conservative part, the most rural part of Vermont, it's solidly red. And you drive along the road and you will see in the election year, I remember 2000, in the election year, there would be a Bush for President sign and a Bernie for Congress sign next to each other, in lawn after lawn after lawn. Bernie consistently carries in the neighborhood of 20% of the Republican vote in Vermont. He was reelected with either 71 or 74% of the total vote to the Senate. And Vermont is not, a hippie haven, solid blue state. The 2 largest cities are Burlington and Montpelier. But you get outside those 2 cities and you are looking at, red state, rural, conservative Republican country. And they have embraced Bernie because he's a truth teller. He's a radical truth teller. We moved to Washington, D.C. 5 years ago. There was an opportunity to do a TV program on the RT network, which is owned by the Russians, and they wanted to put an oar into the water of Al Jazeera and CNN International and BBC and all that. And I said, I've always owned my own show. I won't become an employee. I have to have absolute editorial control by contract. And if you're willing to go along with those terms, which I'd had this conversation earlier with one of the big cable networks here in the United States, and they were unwilling to do that. They were like, you're an employee, you will do what we say, or not, or you won't work here. RT said, no, we'll give you your own show, or we'll carry your show. It's also carried by Free Speech TV. And so, hey, it was something fun. It was my ADD, I guess. I was bored. Let's try something new. It's a 1-hour show. It runs at 7 p.m. on RT, and it runs at 10 p.m. on Free Speech TV. The radio show is noon to 3 Eastern Time. It's on Sirius XM. It's on radio stations around the country. It's also simulcast as television by Free Speech TV on Dish and Direct and a number of cable systems.